Time for an oil change, and you may notice how easily this drain plug let go then just with the small ratchet handle. It's not because it wasn't torqued properly, but because it was only being held in with thread sealant since the last service. And this is why the threads on the sump drain are basically all but gone. In fact, you can see one or two threads there that haven't been cleared out yet, just hanging there loose. So some muppet, not saying who, has over-torqued this drain plug, and it's been getting worse and worse with each service. So now I can't tighten it at all. And this is what I did last time because I didn't have a solution on hand. I just bodged it with thread sealant. That's what this mess is around the threads on the plug. It actually worked perfectly and hasn't leaked a drop of oil since, but it's not a permanent solution. So that led me to this. So there are lots of different solutions out there for stripped drain plugs, and this is the one that appealed the most to me. It seemed a fairly reliable and not too inelegant of a method. It's called the EcoPlug from the US, and it's basically a conical insert with a tapered self-tapping thread that is supposed to bite into your stripped drain hole, and then it has this magnetic cap which gets used for future oil changes. You just use a tool on the cap like this and pull it off. You can see this rubber seal here. It looks pretty lightweight. I suppose it can't be thicker because that would decrease the magnet's strength. I guess this must work, but it does look a bit vulnerable to damage over time if it's going to be reused. It certainly doesn't come with any spare seals. It comes with an epoxy for sealing the threads up. I'll talk about that later. So in principle, a good idea, which is why I thought I'd try it. But there are some obvious gotchas that are fairly plain on first looks. The first is it has in common with other hollow drain insert type designs. For example, these Japanese Hamato valves are quite popular. And I bought one of them too before I realized that I didn't have enough thread left to actually get it installed. Now these are quite nice, and they use a proper valve which locks closed. But one problem with these, by the way, is if you have a recessed drain, that's to say it's enclosed by a surround in the sump casting, the valve body is too bulky to fit, meaning that you'll have to use an extender adapter, which means you now then have this quite bulky contraption sticking out of your sump. But regardless, the universal disadvantage, besides anything else, is the fact that all of these systems necessarily reduce the inner diameter of your drain, obviously because of the wall thickness of the tube and the threads. So that's going to reduce the flow of draining oil, and so increase the time taken for a drain. Maybe that's not a big deal to you. It'll also raise the minimum oil level in the sump once it's drained, to the tune of that wall thickness. Now whether that makes a big difference will depend on your particular sump design. If the drain hole is properly positioned in a lowered drain area in the sump, then it won't matter very much. But if it's just in the wall at the bottom of a sump and in the bottom of a flat and shapeless sump, then it might equate to a considerable volume of old oil that you now can't drain. You could partially mitigate this problem by angling the car. If you're lifting the front on ramps or stands, then you're already doing this, but you could improve the situation by just lifting a bit higher than you normally would. And this, of course, is true of this EcoPlug, but it's made worse in some respect by the conical design, because the taper raises that minimum level as it goes in. Now, this particular model I have here is suited for 12 to 16 millimeter drain holes, which means that if you had a 14 or a 16 millimeter hole, a lot of the inner length of this thread is unnecessary, meaning you could actually hacksaw it off, and that would enlarge the new effective drain hole by a bit, and so mitigate again the problem. If you have a 12 millimeter hole like me, you'll have to leave it, and this is what you're going to be draining your oil through. And the other thing is that cone is going to make a protrusion inside the sump, meaning that any crud or physical contaminants are less likely to be drained along with the oil, because instead of going straight out a hole, they'll now get trapped around the concavity in the area between the old hole and the cone. And then talking about the 12 to 16 millimeter size range, while it means the smaller end of the cone is unnecessarily small for a 16 millimeter hole, on the other hand, it means that the larger end is unnecessarily large for a 12 millimeter hole, and you can't hacksaw that bit off. So this means that when installed in a 12 millimeter hole, you're going to have this large length sticking out, I think. We'll see what that looks like. All right, I'll just get it in the car now before talking any more about it. I should be clear, I understand this is sort of a halfway fixed product, so I don't mean to be too negative. I'm just trying to objectively identify the weaknesses. The proper way to fix a stripped sump like this is to drill and tap a larger hole, maybe use a helicoil. But just going up to a M14 hole in my case would certainly be a good fix. And I'll do that in the future if I'm not happy with how this works out. So you'll want to clean out the drain hole as best you can. Certainly remove any old bits of threads and the like. Oil, of course, just doesn't stop dripping unless you leave it for days on end. So that just has to be dealt with. Then the first stage in installation is cutting, so to say, some guide threads. The instructions say to hand install it and then use a tool to tighten it in. I'd say the trick here is to make sure it's square. If you started tightening it at an angle, you'll probably get into trouble. So take your time and get that right. But it will get a bite, like so, and then you can put a tool on it. It's a 7/8 inch or about 22 millimeter hex. You could just use a crescent spanner. And you continue to turn it until, and I quote, thoroughly tight. Now I wasn't very happy with that because it doesn't mean anything. Thoroughly tight with a small 3/8 inch ratchet handle like here, or with a 2-foot breaker bar. So I really wish that they gave an idea of appropriate torque in relation to the hole size. The problem is you're cutting new thread and you're wedging a cone into a linear hole, which means that if you don't use enough torque, you won't cut enough thread. And if you use too much, you'll either strip out the new thread as soon as you've cut it, or if that holds, then you could even end up cracking the alloy casting of the sump. So really the EcoPlug people should have done some testing and worked out how much torque for each size hole cuts the adequate amount of thread, and then you'd have a bit more certainty in the process. Anyway, I stuck with my little ratchet handle to try to keep things under control, and you can see the new thread cut here in this before and after shot. So far so good. And then you identify where on the plug the threads were engaging, and you clean it all off. And next you apply their epoxy to that area. Now this is where I had some problems. The epoxy is this little dry Play-Doh stuff that you knead together. They say to do that for 30 seconds. The idea is to get it a consistent color. So it's obviously a 2-part epoxy that's activated when you mix it. First problem, it took me quite a lot longer than 30 seconds to get it consistent. And second, it starts going hard straight away. They say 10 minutes curing time. Now, I was able to get it onto the threads, but even that was awkward because it has the consistency of a brownie. It's quite crumbly, and it doesn't actually want to stick to the metal. It keeps coming off it, even though I definitely cleaned these threads with brake clean, so they were certainly free of oil. And then I made the mistake of applying it too far down the threads. I realized I should keep it away from the end, but I assumed that it would be soft enough that it would just get pushed into the right place upon installation. And the thing is, it was way too hard by the time I came to actually install it, and I couldn't push the plug in far enough to even get the threads to engage. So then I tried cutting half the epoxy off to expose more of the lower threads, and that worked, but the moment I tried to tighten it with a tool, the epoxy again was so hard that I think one of the threads actually gave way here. There's no way that it was going in. The epoxy was stopping it. So I recognize that this is sort of user error on my part, and that if I'd been quicker and if I'd avoided those lower threads initially, it probably would have worked. But regardless, I'm going to say I really don't like this epoxy that they've supplied. It's difficult to work with and too quick to cure. So plan B for me was back to the thread sealant. This is Permatex high temperature Teflon infused stuff. It's designed for use on tapered threads, and it's specified for things like my car's transmission drain plug. So it should work well enough here. Being liquid, it's very easy to apply correctly. You only need one revolution of the stuff around a thread, so to say, and then in it goes. I'm just marking the plug here so that I can show you how far I turn it, by the way, from finger tight. Bearing in mind that this is after the threads have already been cut. So that feels pretty tight now. You wouldn't do much more torque on a proper fitted tapered thread. And as you can see from the red mark, it's gone a half turn. And you can see that that thread sealant has been chased up the threads, and the excess has formed a nice continuous perimeter around the outside, which is a good indicator of an intact seal. Now the drawback of this stuff is the curing time in the other direction. They say 4 hours for an initial set and then 24 hours for a final set. So I had to leave this sit for the 4 hours before I could put oil in it. I still think it's better than the horrible epoxy they supplied, so that's a price worth paying from my point of view. So while we wait, let's consider how this looks installed in my 12mm drain. As you can see, it does stick out a fair bit. This does worry me because it's only held in place by the 1 or 2 threads it's cut at the outside of that drain, and the length it's hanging out by does present a bit of leverage. So if you hit that with enough force, I think you could knock it out. Maybe with a tool when working on the car. But also, what if you drove over something on the road, on the motorway one day and you managed to catapult some debris into it? I don't know. I'm willing to run the risk, but it does strike me as a little vulnerable, and I think that you should be aware of it. Okay, I'm just going to run a liter of oil through the engine as a bit of a flush, in case there's some excess uncured sealant that wants to mix with the oil, but also to test for leaks and then demo that magnetic cap. So the sealant has definitely worked fine. It's good stuff. I haven't had any problems, and obviously the magnet cap is holding fine too. And this is what it looks like when you pull that out. Remember, this is only a liter or so don't expect a good amount of pressure here, but certainly you will have reduced flow in the future. And I noticed that this trickle flow continued for quite a bit longer than the same stage used to through the original drain hole. The good news is that it's easy to clean up that cap and seal, and it's real quick and simple to put it back in. Finally, there's this vinyl cover which goes on. I don't know what the point of it is. I guess it reduces the likelihood of the magnet itself getting knocked off. Okay, well, it's all worked as advertised on the tin, so to say, so if you're willing to accept the caveats I've discussed, I think it's a decent solution. I'd prefer to have more specific sizing, i.e. For myself, a 12mm model without the excess required to also go up to a 16mm diameter. That would be nice. Like I said, I don't like the epoxy, but that and the other things can be managed, so I'd generally recommend it as a stopgap solution. But all I'm saying is I think there'll probably be a drill and tap in my future.